Hello, and welcome to the American Compass podcast. I'm Drew Holden, American Compass's managing editor, and your host for today's episode. This week, your usual host, Oren Cass, is in the guest seat to discuss his recent Compass Point essay on electric vehicles, titled The Electric Slide. In our conversation, Oren and I discuss U.S. policy towards EVs and why conservatives ought to care about the technology's future and the government's role therein. We've got a lot going on this week at American Compass more broadly. On Saturday, Oren had a piece in the New York Times. This is what elite failure looks like, explaining that we need to take seriously the majority opinion across political issues that the elites of both political parties have failed to respond to. On Monday, Oren had his first installment of Bankruptcy Court on his Substack, Understanding America. Surely you've all subscribed to that, but if not, go to Understanding America at substack.com and subscribe. Today, our coalitions director, Duncan Braid, has a new piece on the Commons responding to a recent article, We're All Soviets Now, in the Free Press. Duncan has an antidote to the corruption, sclerotic government, and cultural decline that is increasingly apparent in the United States and defined the late stages of the Soviet Union. A responsive politics, reflecting the will of the governed, not the social and political elites. Later this week, John Seiler, Senior Fellow at the National Academy of Scholars, will be on the Commons with some encouraging developments around intellectual diversity and conservative faculty retention on college campuses. You heard that right. Good news from American universities. And we'll also have remarks delivered by Elbridge Colby, principal at Marathon Initiative, titled The Right Foreign Policy for Conservatives is Prioritization, given at this week's NatCon 4. And with that, enjoy my conversation with Oren Cass.
I'm joined now by Oren Cass, chief economist at American Compass. Oren, what's it like to be on the guest side of the table?
I love being on the guest side of the table. It's a lot easier. I can just do whatever I want and I have no responsibility, so I'm excited.
That's right. Well, responsibility, I suppose, is therefore placed on me. But Oren, we wanted to talk to you today about a recent piece that you wrote as a Compass Point. It's called The Electric Slide. Credit to you, really good name on it.
Thank you.
But the piece is about electric vehicles and how there's kind of a mismatch between the hype around electric vehicles and the demand and the way that U.S. policy is actually helping do anything. So I guess my first question is, what made you think that now is a good time to talk about electric vehicles?
Well, this is good. I thought you were going to say great title, but the piece was okay too. It's like, that's about right. I think we had noticed, the Compass team had noticed really over the past few months that more and more of the conversations we were having with policymakers ended up talking about electric vehicles, whether it was labor policy, the UAW strike was a huge area of focus. Industrial policy obviously was going on with IRA implementation, with batteries, with EVs, huge piece. On trade with China, you have the tariffs and a lot of issues there. On critical minerals, a lot of that is a story. On environmental policy, a lot of it is an EV story. And so it certainly seemed like this was an important thing to understand well, but I also think it's an especially important one for conservatives to really grapple with, because it's not exactly clear what the conservative position is. I mean, in
Right.
theory, based on, especially as conservatives focus more on reshoring, on building domestic industry, on technological leadership, it's like, oh, well, this is great. Well, electric vehicles is something to focus on. On the other hand, it's not entirely clear if electric vehicles are actually a worthwhile technology, but for the climate focus.
Sure.
And so is the point supposed to be we need to protect the U.S. market from China because we really want domestic EVs? Is it, surely we don't want to just let the Chinese EVs and wipe out the conventional domestic market, but
Right.
Is there a world in which just the conventional domestic market goes on indefinitely? I think you have to have perspective on the underlying technologies, on the actual market dynamics, to even figure out sort of what the conservative priorities here and what we should be trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think even if the conservative position is still kind of being developed or articulated or thought through, it seems pretty clear that there's a democratic position on a lot of the issues that are kind of attendant to electric vehicles. Could you talk through a little bit what those look like and then the problems that we're seeing with those?
Yeah, well, it's actually an interesting question because, I would say there's a huge division on the Democratic side here and within progressive circles. And so this is another reason it's actually important, is that there's a huge opportunity for conservatives potentially versus this very conflicted progressive point of view that is quite incoherent. Because of course on the one hand you have your progressives who say, climate change is an existential threat and we should be on this World War III footing to combat it. And if that's your view, well then Chinese EVs are a godsend, right? The sooner we're all driving around BYD seagulls or whatever. The fact, I feel like they're mocking us, calling them dolphins and seagulls and whatever, but it's very effective. Well trolled, CCP.
Yeah, exactly,
well trolled.
right.
So, gosh, how quickly can we get a seagull in every driveway?
Sure.
But then you have the folks who are less crazy, I would say, who say, whoa, we want to do something on climate. We need to do something on climate, but it can't come at the expense of American industry. So the question is, how quickly can we stand up an American EV industry? And then that gets a little dicey, because if it doesn't seem like you can actually do that very quickly, well then you end up where I think the Biden administration has been, in this awkward middle ground of sort of, we're going to say we're committed to the domestic EVs, but we really need the Chinese batteries, so we're still going to kind of do the Chinese batteries, and then when the American workers get really upset about that, we're going to throw them this other thing, and we're sort of
give them a bone to kind of tie them over.
Right.
They have to do this thing.
I'm often drawn to the metaphor of epicycles. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
I'm not.
Before we had the heliocentric model of the solar system, astronomers actually did extraordinary work coming up with explanations for why the planets that were all supposed to be orbiting the Earth were moving the way that they did. And so the epicycle was the idea that they orbit the Earth, but then they're also orbits within the orbits. And then when that still didn't quite explain things right, they had orbits within the orbits and as with approximating a curve with slopes, you can they successfully approximated and predicted the paths of these planets with a completely wrong model.
Exactly. I would imagine that a model that gives you something that is coherent within the model but is factually preposterous is probably something you are drawn to in general.
And we see from time to time among progressive policymakers.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's interesting you point out just the technical difficulties of getting something like a supply chain domestically for EVs set up. But what is it, right? What is the problem? Why is it so hard? You talked a lot about mines in your piece as kind of one of these components. I remember I read through it and I was thinking to myself, man, I had no idea that there are this many logistical sorts of challenges.
Yeah, I think the key contribution of the piece conceptually is to try and make clear how central batteries are to all of this. Obviously an electric vehicle has to have a battery, and that's always been one of the most expensive elements. But I was really struck as we worked on the issue of the extent to which an electrical vehicle really is a battery.
Yeah,
I mean, when you're talking about what is different or hard, it is the fact that you have to have this massive battery. Conversely, when you're talking about what's so great about an electric vehicle, a lot of it is, well, if you could solve those hard parts of the battery, there's a lot of real advantages to having a battery.
Yeah.
And so if you want to know who's doing well in the EV space, who's doing badly, why things are getting cheaper, why things aren't what consumers want, the answer is essentially always the battery.
Right.
And I think the best point of departure on that is actually to think about the UAW strike.
Yeah.
Because it gets directly to the economics of this question. And it was either Ford or GM CEO who had gone on the record and said, look, building an electric vehicle requires 40% less labor. And when I first saw that, I thought wow, that's remarkable.
Yeah.
Essentially you're saying that each worker building the vehicle therefore is almost twice as productive.
Right.
I mean, obviously there are going to be transition costs, but those are going to be incredible jobs.
Yeah.
And think of what you can do for the cost of the vehicle and so forth. So many advantages. Mm-hmm. And then you look up, you say but that's not what's happening at all.
Right.
What's going on here? The answer is that stat was excluding the battery. So if you take as a given that somebody else drives into your factory with a completed battery, you need much less labor because you don't have to do the entire internal combustion engine powertrain. But the flip side is that the battery is 40% of the cost of the car.
Right, exactly.
Not coincidentally, both the numbers
look
are
how
40%.
those numbers tick
Look at that.
Yep.
And so what you're actually doing is taking one model of vehicle, which is a lot of intensive manufacturing work inside the factory and in the tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, where you typically have good unionized American jobs,
Yep.
and you're replacing it with this giant square thing
Yep.
filled
Right.
with extremely expensive and difficult to refine, to mine, to refine, to put together chemically batteries.
Right.
And unlike all of that work that's done in the factory for a conventional vehicle, the mining might be like some indentured slave child
Right, a
in
child
the
who's
Congo.
yeah.
And all of the refining might be done in these massive Chinese processing plants. They're just spewing effluent everywhere
Yep,
they can.
yep.
And then the box shows up at the factory.
Yep.
And that's in effect what is happening. And to your question, I told you I love
It's
this
a
climate.
complicated issue.
I can talk about whatever I want, and you're sitting there being like, oh, well, I'm pretty sure that
There was
not
a
the
question somewhere in what I said to him.
And so this is the mining point,
Right.
is that, we could actually go a whole longer on how do you think about that relative to, fossil fuel extraction and so
A
forth.
conversation for another day. I'm sure you understand.
Or even 5 minutes from now. But putting that to the side, I would say that actually is different.
Yeah.
The battery is, as part of the vehicle, is essentially something that is being developed through mining in other parts of the world, processing in other parts of the world, assembly at the battery stage, where China in particular is just miles ahead of everybody else. And those aren't things you can even just start quickly.
Right.
And so, to this question of sort of the progressive dilemma, either you take this box from China, which is 40% of the value of the vehicle,
Right.
which would obviously have catastrophic effects for the domestic industry,
Yep.
or you say, no, we have to be able to do this box here in the US,
Yep.
which first of all means decade, 2 decades before you actually stand up the mining, stand up the processing, get good at the assembly, or is just wildly expensive. And all of those claims about look how the cost curve is coming down, they're almost at cost parity, these are attractive to consumers, all that assumes the Chinese box.
Exactly, right, because you've got the reduced prices there. And I think one of the other things that you mentioned in the piece that's really interesting is that even when these prices have kind of artificially come down, consumers still aren't buying. Right, and that there's a New York Times headline that I read kind of in conjunction with this piece that said EV sales are slowing, Teslas are slumping, right? And so why isn't if we've gotten these batteries at a fraction of the cost it would take to make them here, why aren't the cars expensive enough for U.S. consumers to be interested? Why aren't people buying it?
So this is sort of it's like an interesting, connected obviously, but also somewhat discrete issue, which is, okay, are EVs actually what people want?
Yeah.
And what you're seeing is a total stalling out of growth in the EV market. In fact, in the first quarter of this year, EVs as a share of the US market actually declined, which is shocking. I mean, you could be an EV pessimist and not think wow, people are actually going to be buying fewer of these things. And what it looks like to me has happened is, across a lot of technologies, people anticipate what's called an S-curve, which is there's this sort of initial gradual period of you got to get the early adopters on board, you have to validate, and then at some point you sort of cross this threshold and it starts zooming up. The S-curve is then, because after almost everybody has adopted it, you can only grow so much.
Right.
People looked at the US market and said, we've just hit this threshold. We just got up to the 5-10%, here we go.
And this was in 2023, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And it turns out that what was really happening is the US isn't just one aggregate market.
Right.
There was the San Francisco-Seattle market.
Yeah, exactly.
Which had gone through this S-curve and zoomed up.
Yep.
I mean, you look at penetration in San Francisco, it is already the adopted technology.
Exactly what progressives would like the entire country to be.
And there are some wealth of consumer elements, there are some cultural elements, there are some local regulatory elements all driving that. You look at the rest of the country and it's just a big nothing.
Yep.
It hasn't even really started. And so I think it was a misunderstanding to think we were building up to and breaking through that initial phase. What you have really is still a country that, for the most part, is not interested in EVs. And there are a number of different reasons for that. One is the economics are still just not that good.
Yep.
If you are being a rational consumer and don't think like you yourself are solving climate change by buying this vehicle, it's like, well, why am I paying more for this?
Right.
And then what you see is it's not just the sticker price. People are seeing repair costs are much higher.
Yeah.
As a result of that, insurance costs tend to be higher. Resale values tend to be lower. And so there's both just bad economics and uncertainty of economics that, like, I'll let we'll wait until someone else does this.
Sure.
And then you see it all the way through then to the charging infrastructure stage, where again, same thing, the charging infrastructure is just not where it needs to be, either to support widespread home charging or to be able to reliably charge on the go. And so everyone's basically sort of saying, I'm still going to be over here on the sidelines.
Yeah, and it's not particularly close either, right? We're not splitting hairs about, like, are we 75% of the way there on charging stations? How bad are we talking on some of this stuff?
No, that's right. And again, especially in the vast swaths of the country where there aren't a lot of electric vehicles, there is very little charging infrastructure. A big piece of the Inflation Reduction Act was supposed to be, I think it was $7 or $8 billion for federally funded charging infrastructure. Our great transportation secretary Pete Buttigieg had a very awkward exchange recently on Face the Nation where they basically said, like, it looks like you've built less than 10 stations total, right?
Right.
So,
this
like,
is in percentages.
Right. So we've driven that all the way down to $1 billion a station, and that's probably not going to get it done, or even signal that we're like on the right course.
Right.
The last thing I think is really important to keep in mind with EVs in the U.S., especially compared to places like China, to some extent Europe, where they're being adopted much more rapidly, is that the U.S. car culture is different.
Sure.
And I don't just mean that in like we like our Mustangs, that like revving them
muscle
up.
cars,
right.
1970s,
The entire layout of the country and what people expect and need their cars for, and at least, relative to those places, still having larger families and so on and so forth, obviously much larger share of pickup trucks and SUVs, you need a bigger battery for that.
Yep, exactly.
And you're seeing that happen. Batteries are getting bigger.
Yep.
But that only further doubles down on the centrality of the battery.
Right, exactly. If we can't build the small batteries here and don't have any supply chain to support any of it, how can we possibly scale that up for pickup trucks, for SUVs, for anything else?
Exactly. And so this is sort of the place you're in, which now for policymakers, especially on the right of center, that aren't so interested in just sort of forcing everybody into an electric vehicle, you have, I think, this fair question of, okay, are EVs even going to be the future?
Right.
I mean, there are some things, when we look at like chips and the CHIPS Act, there was no one out there who was like, well, maybe like really fast processors just aren't that important.
Yeah, right.
If you were worried about that, then the CHIPS Act might not make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, exactly.
On EVs, if let's say everybody was already driving EVs and we just lost leadership and all the best EVs were coming out of China, it would be very easy to say, like, we really need to catch up on EVs.
Right.
Here, it's not as obvious, right? And it's interesting, the Japanese automakers and Toyota in particular have to some extent bet against this.
Yeah.
So Toyota has very publicly said, for all of the reasons we've just been discussing, EVs are not the no-brainer that some folks are saying.
Right.
We actually think hybrids are going to make more sense long-term. Now so there are all these different classes of EV, right? You've got we just have a battery.
Yep.
You've got the, Generation 1 Prius, which is a hybrid that has a battery that charges when you brake and like tries to use that a little bit. In between, you have what's called the plug-in hybrid, which is the idea that you have a very small battery that you charge
doesn't
up.
get good range, right?
That's right. It's good for your little drives around town.
Yeah.
And you also have a gas tank because if you're going on that long drive, you need it.
Right.
And we're just not going to spend all that money on the big battery anyway.
Yeah.
And you can see how that, like, based on everything we've just discussed, well, there are some real advantages to that.
Yeah.
Relative to the drawbacks of a battery.
Yeah.
But you're not getting all of those benefits of the battery. You still have to put the full internal combustion engine.
You're still
and
using
powertrain,
gasoline,
etc.
So, yeah.
Right. If anything, you're now upping the labor requirements in your factory.
Yeah, exactly.
Which, that's a classic example of like, oh, well, great, more jobs. But if you can't actually sell the car for more,
exactly.
now
it's
it's less productive.
Yeah.
And so I think this is kind of exactly where conservatives have to figure out how they want to approach the issue, because you could just say, look at all these idiots elsewhere throwing all this money at EVs, let's just sit back.
Right.
But there are a lot of risks to that too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's obviously the school of thought of don't interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake from the very narrow sort of partisan political angle. But I do think, reading your piece, it does beg the question you would eventually just ask and then answer the question is, why should conservatives care, right? Why wouldn't we just let Democrats flail, be it on the progressive side or the more Biden-y side on this issue, and just let it crumble on its own and go back to what we know and understand about cars? Why should conservatives have an approach that is distinct from letting it all collapse?
Right, so I think that's exactly the right question, and I think there's a two-part answer to it. One part is there's a very good chance that EVs are the technology of the future. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you can solve the battery problem, EVs are pretty great in a whole lot of ways. And so, in a world where you have an awful lot of automakers betting an awful lot on this, to simply say, we don't care, we're going to keep the Chinese EVs out, we're not going to invest in EVs here, our automakers are going to keep making internal combustion engine cars, even as China and Europe maybe through getting crushed by Chinese imports, shift completely, and 30 years from now, maybe that will have worked out fine. I mean, there's not a whole lot of upside, right? Like, that's not a huge win.
Right. Maybe we're just captive to their market, and it's not horrifically bad.
Right. Or, well, if internal combustion engines turn out to be the better technology, then woohoo, we didn't waste a lot of money. But it's, that's something. But flip side, if EVs do turn out to in fact be a better technology, China drives cost all the way down. There are whole new generations of battery technology coming online, etc. And we've just sat it out. Well, now our choice is a lot worse than it is today. Now it is the sort of hey, how do we stay in the game isn't even really on the table. It's either you can be 1950s Argentina. And just no, we're just sticking with our.
We're gonna go with the way we always have.
That's right. Even as the rest of the world ignores us and gets all the benefits of this better thing that we can't do.
Right.
Or you capitulate, and goodbye American auto industry.
Yeah.
And so part one of this argument is it is responsible policy to sort of place a bet against that.
Yep.
And stay in the game, so to speak.
Yeah, you're hedging, right? I think is how you described it in the piece. It's you're hedging against a world where we don't know what the outcome is going to be.
Exactly. And so, again, I don't think the response is therefore, okay, mandate everyone drive an EV 10 years from now.
Right.
But it is to say, okay, do we have the right supply chains to be able to build batteries? Are we staying at the cutting edge of battery technology? Do our automakers know how to make EVs, etc.?
Right.
The second reason is that, for the most part, all of those things I just described, it turns out are things you'd want to do even if EVs weren't going to be the future technology.
Right.
And this is where I think Biden's policy has gotten things exactly backwards. Biden's policy is and progressive generally, intensively focused on we have to get those EVs onto the street.
Yep.
And so we're going to do all our focus on the cell EVs.
Right.
And much less focus on the actually be good at batteries, actually process minerals well, actually mine the minerals.
Right.
It should be exactly the opposite. Everybody is very rightly focused on critical minerals, even if you've never heard of an EV.
Yep,
there are tons of reasons we need to get back into that game. Everyone is rightly focused on processing, where China has locked down an absolute stranglehold, regardless of whether or not you even ever want EVs.
Yep.
Even when you get to the kind of battery technology and assembly stage, a lot of those same processes And even batteries themselves
Right.
are massively important technologies, even if you don't believe in EVs.
For everything else, and
Right, whether it's just electronics, just if you sort of want to forecast out, like
Yep,
what
exactly.
we use a lot of,
right.
batteries.
And what are we going to use more of over the next 50, 100, 150 years?
Right, it's as much as you didn't want to rely on OPEC for fossil fuels over the last 100, you probably want to be able to do batteries.
Yeah.
And the nice thing is, unlike, as it turns out, we have a tremendous amount of fossil fuel, but unlike fossil fuels where it's like, well, either it's in the ground or not,
Yep.
pretty much any country, certainly the United States, has the capability to do this well if it decides it wants to.
Right, because that's just a manufacturing capability, right?
Well, that's right, and at the level of the minerals, the critical minerals are dispersed widely. I mean, like we find new lithium
Right.
finds are happening in the U.S. constantly.
Yep.
One of the ones people don't understand at all, you hear the term rare earth mineral, and or rare earth element, and you think like, oh, those must be really rare.
They're on the asteroids. We're going to go up and get them from
Right.
the asteroids.
In fact, it turns out rare earth elements are like everywhere. They're
Right.
rare earth because they're a very small percentage
Yes,
of
yes.
of your handful of dirt. Not very
Right.
much of it is rare earth
Right.
element. And so there's a lot of complicated refining you have to do to get it.
Yep.
But you don't have to worry about whether you have access to
Yeah.
it. And so and then it's really interesting if you look at it from the perspective of the automakers. Even when you get to that final EV step, even if you say EVs aren't the best technology, the US is never going to convert to EVs, those automakers still want to be globally competitive companies.
Right. Right.
And it turns out you actually have to be able to be good at making EVs to compete globally.
Yeah.
And so even if you told them you're never going to sell an EV in the United States,
Yep.
it would still be in your interest if you want to have a strong auto manufacturing sector
Right.
to have an EV capability.
Yep.
And so for all those reasons, I think it's really important for conservatives to move beyond the sort of partisan polarization of EVs.
Yeah.
Because that's actually, when we're talking about consumers not wanting them, a huge piece of this is it's now like, it's just a political thing.
Right.
at
They're
this
just
point.
the climate change reducing thing in theory.
Right, right, that's right. There's both the like, oh, like, are you a climate person or not?
Yeah.
There's also just even the simpler, like, the government is telling me to do this.
And therefore
thing.
I do.
And or, right, versus like, well, then therefore I don't want to.
Yep.
And so moving beyond that, and this is where conservative leaders, I think, have an important role to play as well, and saying, look, we're not going to tell people they have to buy EVs, but being good at knowing how to make EVs and being a leader in all the steps that would ensure we can make EVs if and when people do want to buy them, that's really important. And none of that is going to happen if there is no government policy involved, because all of those steps are steps where, for one thing, other countries have government very heavily involved.
Yes.
And so now this is where you get into that kind of CHIPS analog.
Yeah.
Where like, well, everyone else, their governments are doing it.
Yeah.
So declaring
there have
that
to be rules for the road one way or another.
Right. So you can't say like, well, the quote free market solution
Yeah.
is to just let everybody else's companies get all this support and ours have none.
Right.
And then the other thing is that especially up at the sort of critical mineral and processing stage, first of all, government is inherently involved in the controlling of the resources, the regulation, and so forth. There are also just places where you have massive market failures.
Yeah.
Like even if you just want to be like a super normie economist about it, especially when you look at mining,
Yeah.
you have these minerals trading on global markets and being intentionally manipulated by the Chinese in particular, where the price of lithium went up 10x a couple years ago,
Yep.
and then fell by 80% the year after that. And you have the people being like, oh, well, in one of
That's
these
weird.
worlds, this is a really great investment to make.
Yeah.
Like, let's open up this mine.
Right.
And then in the other worlds, like, we will never make any money on this.
Yeah, and without that certainty, you're not going to see businesses doing something, especially in a heavily regulated industry, right? Like the whole point of the extraction process, or the challenge of the extraction process, is also a regulatory question, and how involved does the government become as a result of what's needed there. So I think you make a obviously compelling case about the why here. But what is the what, right? What is it that conservative leaders and policymakers could and should be doing in order to develop that sort of conservative policy on EVs?
Yeah, so I would sort of break it into those 4 steps that we've just been talking about in the supply chain, and as we were saying a minute ago, sort of reverse the current emphasis. I would describe it as we sort of have this wedge shape of policy you can picture. That's extremely skinny down at the mineral end and gets like very fat on the go buy an EV.
Yep.
We really need to flip that around and be like very fat on the mineral end,
Sure.
getting down to very skinny at the go buy an EV. Not because, you know, EVs aren't important, but because the market will determine whether or not people should and will go buy EVs.
Right.
We want to make sure that that is possible and worth doing
Yeah.
if and when the technology is right. And so, you know, if you start up at that mineral phase, I really think we need to take an approach to minerals and mining that we have over really the past 50 years taken to fossil fuels when they were so important. And really having, which is not to say they are not still important, but when that was, you know, starting with the oil shock in the 70s, the very intensive focus on we need to get our fossil fuel output up.
Right, because something bad happened, and I think one of the points here is that ideally we'll be able to get some of this in action before we have that 1970s moment with EVs and charging stations or whatever it looks like.
That's right. And by the way, the world is more dependent on China for these minerals and processed minerals in particular than it has been on OPEC for fossil fuels.
A very good
point. If you want to kind of get a sense. This is one of the funny things about the sort of Biden model, is if like finally like the US like through fracking has become this energy superpower, no longer dependent, and like what's the first thing we do? We turn around and say like, let's switch to a different vehicle in which we can once again be entirely reliant on our main adversary.
Exactly.
Like, who's with us?
Yeah.
And so starting there and saying, you know, with lessons learned from the very successful efforts of fossil fuel development, which were private sector led, but had very important kind of, I hate to use this term because it's the Biden administration has ruined it forever, but a very sort of all of government mindset when it comes to like there are so many policies that affect this and we need to think about them. We need to take that approach to minerals and mining. And it's so funny because mining is this thing that like people thought like went out. You know,
exactly. This is a technology from the 20s that we're never going to come back to.
And in fact, it is regulated by, mining is still largely regulated by a law from 1872. And you've got, you know, unsurprisingly, because things have sort of just evolved and no one's focused on them, you've got all these different overlapping jurisdictions. Is it on public land? Is it, which way, you know, what kind of mine are you doing?
Exactly.
And these people, you know, state versus, you're near tribal land, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So saying, no, developing mining and the extraction of minerals as natural resources is a vitally important economic priority for us. And we need to do that through sort of regulatory streamlining. We need to do that with and make those projects attractive with the sort of price insurance that we use for other commodities that are facing this kind of challenge.
Right, because this isn't a unique challenge. I think when you disaggregate it.
That's exactly right. You sort of state it as a general problem. People say, "Oh, yeah, that is a problem."
Of course,
look at that. And then I think also you need to think about it in terms of investment because you know they're actually, if I were to sort of pick something that was good in the Biden, you know, Inflation Reduction Act and so forth, they do have some loan programs that are doing things like financing the major new project to build a lithium processing plant.
Right. Yep.
And that's good. That is something I think we should be financing. But we are in this world now where it's like, oh, well, chips are important, so let's spend 2 years fighting about the CHIPS Act.
Right.
Oh, now lithium mining is important. Well, like, let's make that part of a $500 billion climate policy.
Exactly.
Right? What we actually need here is typically called something like an industrial finance corporation or a national development bank. We need a standing entity that has capital that it can loan to or invest in critical projects, whether that is in the semiconductor industry or the critical minerals industry, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But having that set up, so that's step one, to get mining back in business, frankly, as a really important and modern industry, not this, you know, 1870s silver mine.
19th century regulation.
Step two then is the processing, and it's really interesting. It's not in mining, but in processing that China has really most intensively focused in cornering the market.
Okay.
They're actually, you know, Australia has lots of lithium. Democratic Republic of Congo has lots of cobalt, lots of nickel from Indonesia. China and Chinese companies then setting up in some of these places focused on the processing stage, which is where you need these, you know, massive, incredibly energy intensive, by default very polluting facilities to take these massive amounts of raw material and crush and chemical processes, heat, all the different things you need to do to extract out the right pieces of the stuff and get it in the right form.
Right.
And so the mineral processing is then a separate industry, but one that the U.S. also needs to be a leader in.
Yeah.
Partly because of that dependence point.
Yep.
Partly because like the economics of mining the lithium and using the lithium in the battery makes a lot more sense if you don't have to put the lithium on a boat and send it to China and then bring it back from China. But also, I do think it's worth noting that if you actually care about the environment,
yes, right. If you are interested in this kind of climate policy, saving the planet, reducing pollution, what have you, all the promises of EV that I think have been around since the technology was still in its infancy, like true infancy, even relative to now. The whole point of this was to be able to reduce CO2 output, right? And you lose that when you're sending all of these things to a dirty factory in China, and then having that be what is the bedrock either for American cars or for the Chinese cars too.
That's right. And so there's very good study on the sort of carbon intensity of the battery production process. And look, obviously burning gas every time you drive your car is going to be even more carbon intensive. But you'd be surprised how carbon intensive the one-time making of the battery is relative to the lifetime of driving a gas-powered vehicle. And China's carbon intensity producing this stuff is like 2x.
Yeah.
What a European country, for instance, can do it at. And then on top of that, you just have the conventional pollution, right?
Sure.
Like if environment doesn't just mean CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yep.
And so there's this appalling New York Times story that I quote at the end of the piece, where particularly because it was not an op-ed, it was like an actual news report.
Yeah.
That just went ahead and said, in an ideal world, which is just such a funny phrase for a
incredible
news piece.
framing for a policy piece.
In an ideal world, it basically says, if the U.S. and China weren't in this, global rivalry.
Right, which I'm sure will be resolved by natural means any moment as far
That's
as the
okay.
Times is
We're in
concerned.
our ideal world, which is agreed
right.
upon by all, says the reporter. We wouldn't have to mine lithium in an environmentally sensitive spot in Nevada because we could just get our batteries worry-free from China.
Worry-free.
Worry-free. And it's like, now it's especially funny because in particular the environmental concern about this Nevada facility, this huge lithium find, happens to be that it's too close to tribal lands and a Native American burial site.
Right.
And so it's I would just worry a lot less about the environment if we weren't mining near there.
Right, because that's somehow...
And whatever China's doing, I would just feel a lot better.
Yeah.
And again, where we started with what is going on in the progressive coalition, these are, depending on what you're prioritizing when, it's very funny to see the way these things run into each other crosswise.
Sure.
But we should want to be doing this here in the U.S. for both economic and environmental reasons. And doing that is going to require both massive changes to our environmental regulations so that you make sure you're doing it cleanly, but not with decades of reviews and litigation and so on and so forth.
Right, and I think one of the key points you mentioned toward the end of the piece was if we do all these things right, even if EVs don't take off, even if this isn't the future of technology, the United States will benefit across our manufacturing policy, across trade policy, across environmental policy, and so you don't lose a lot in adapting this approach.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, these are, again, when you're talking about the minerals, when you're talking about the processing, you're still at the levels of, these are just economically valuable activities,
right,
whether or not you're all driving around in EVs.
Yeah.
Step 3 then is when you get to actually being good at making batteries. And that's a place where it really is, it looks most like the chips situation in the sense that this is a technology that the US used to be the leader in.
Exactly, yep.
And we just let it go because we thought it didn't matter. It's, my favorite thing to cite on just failure of technology policy generally is this incredible essay that Andy Grove, the longtime leader of Intel, when Intel was a truly great, when Intel was Intel, he wrote back in 2010. He'd already retired by then, talking about how the U.S. focus on just efficiency and driving down cost was leading it to offshore things. Offshoring would lead to the loss of capacity not just in manufacturing but ultimately in innovation.
Right.
The example he uses is battery technology. right? Like this was entirely predictable and in fact predicted that we were just, well, it doesn't matter who makes the whatever, so like, let's just let China be the battery place. And that's what happened. Not by coincidence is BYD, which is now the top EV company, they were a battery company.
Yeah.
Turns out that getting really good at the batteries is then really important for things like getting really good at the cars. And so, taking back that leadership is going to require investment at the technological level and actually creating the incentives to build the facilities here, and importantly making sure that they are US-owned facilities. Because there are lots of places where you'd say like, well look, there's some foreign leader. The important thing is that they be doing business in America, right? So like we're all very excited that Taiwan Semiconductor is building a chips plant in Arizona. That's great. We're all very pleased when Toyota came and started making cars in the South. That's great. We should not likewise be excited about the Chinese battery company coming and making the batteries in the US because,
exactly.
And obviously we've done a lot of other work on Compass at Compass about this. If you're a company domiciled in and controlled by interests in the People's Republic of China, you are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party.
Right.
And just as we did not want like the Soviet Union running large parts of our economy, it would not be wise to hand that to the CCP, which is not liberal, democratic, a market, anything.
At all. Right. And would be getting all of our trade secrets in the process.
That's right. And so, frankly, I would like to see us treat their battery intellectual property with roughly respect.
Yeah.
Roughly the respect that they have treated our battery intellectual property. And, but ultimately be focused on the idea that we do want to be able to do this stuff in the United States.
That absolutely makes sense, Oren. I think we're going to probably leave it there. The one thing I did want to make sure that you could mention, if you'd like to, is feedback on the piece. How have people reacted to your perspective?
Yeah, it's been really interesting actually, because this was much as the Biden administration has been trying and failing to thread the needle on this topic, at the end of the day, what we're doing in taking it on is likewise trying to figure out what an actual viable path forward is, given all of these both substantive and political obstacles.
Yeah.
And there's certainly a world where like you do the research and you say like, all right, well here's what actually makes sense, and everyone on all sides is just like, no, that's stupid, I don't like it. And it's been very encouraging to see that the response has been the opposite, that both Biden-aligned folks and very conservative policy folks have looked at it and said, you know what, this actually makes a lot of sense. Obviously different parts people will agree with and disagree with, but I think that the approach that we took, which is to actually start with the actual technological reality, and then layer on top of that, okay, given that reality, what would you do if your goal was a strong U.S. economy with strong U.S. producers and the ability to transition to EVs if that is the right technology? Yep. And I think that frame is an appealing one, especially for conservatives. I think, frankly, some on the left who are struggling with the internal contradictions of looking for an out, perhaps, are kind of looking at that saying, like, that actually doesn't sound so bad compared, because here's the question, what is the alternative, right? And this is sort of, maybe there's a good place to end, is that, obviously there are a lot of people on the left who do take the climate things to be the be-all and end-all, and like, we must do whatever is best for the climate. Yeah. And you might say like, well, like, okay, those were lots of really interesting points, but the correct answer is still the BYD seagull in every driveway.
Sure.
And the reality is that that's just not actually in the option set.
Right.
That the only way the US is actually going to move forward with a transition to EVs is if they can be American-made EVs with an American supply chain all the way up through batteries, which means you have to get all this other stuff right first. And so, in fact, if all you care about is the climate and getting EVs on the road as quickly as possible, hate to break it to you, this is still what you have to be doing.
Yep, that's the game you got to play. Well, Oren, thank you for joining us. Thank you for making the trip. I can't think of a better advertisement for why you should go out and read the piece. It's the Electric Slide. American EV policy is failing. Here's how to fix it, at the American Compass website. And again, Thank you for the conversation, and we'll be back soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.